this.
The men who turned the civilian airplanes into weapons on 9/11 regarded themselves not as terrorists, but as soldiers. They're soldiers in a decades-old conflict. They and their sympathizers and those who hold contrary yet violent convictions seek to turn the slogan, "The Clash of Civilizations," into reality. 9/11 was part of morphing Euro-American Islamophobia into Muslimophobia. Many in the global South reciprocate by fearing and loathing domineering forms of westernization. Before the jets were turned into weapons of mass destruction, other weapons were deployed by nations and global conglomerates. These include support for regimes that impoverish and oppress their people, corrupting officials, mocking religious symbols, and media-transmitted seductive representations of so-called modernity. Now, Fox News would never do that, would it? Many Muslims, Hindus, and secularists consider their values and societies under attack by new forms of old imperialism. Skirmishes had already taken place in the parking garage at the Trade Center, the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And then we had the big power politics of Iran-Iraq war and the Desert Storm campaign of 9/11. The stage for taking the war to the American home front on 9/11 was set. And Osama bin Laden, in the 1990s, had issued in one of his speeches a declaration of war against America. I believe that we are not doomed to the clash of civilizations, but we are in danger of one. As religion is used to foment fury, so religion can engender understanding and cooperation. Yes, the world's religions are challenged by internal debates over teachings, practices, ethnicity, and geography. Each, however, still has its plugs and its sockets, points and openings for connecting to one another in order to transmit divine power and hope to our world. A crucial religious task is to confront and reverse incitements to hatred and violence, and then to work to replace the clash of civilizations with the dialogue and coalition of civilizations. As a Christian and an American, an immigrant, naturalized American, I think Islam provides a wedge into present dilemmas and opportunities. Islam's theology of creation and anthropology of spirituality can open ways for believers in all faiths and commitments to begin healing and peacemaking in our world. And as you might suspect, I point to Fethullah Gulen and the movement Hizmet, which means service in the name of God, as essential leaders within Islam and for carrying forward that wider religious task. It would be presumptuous for me to comment on internal Muslim issues, and I know that Gulen, or as he is called by those close to him, Hoja Effendi, the honored teacher, and Hizmet associates are working in the area of Islamic relations, internal Islamic relations.
As Alex mentioned so much about stories, let me start with a story. Actually, it's a joke, I guess. I received this just yesterday from a friend. Two Christians are lost in the Sahara Desert. One is David, the other is Michael. They're dying of hunger and thirst when they suddenly come upon an oasis with what looks like a mosque in the middle. David said to Michael, "Look, let's pretend we're Muslims, otherwise we'll not get any food or drink. I'm going to call myself Muhammad." Michael refused to change his name. He said, "My name is Michael, and I will not pretend to be other than what I am. I'm Michael." The Imam of the mosque receives both well and asks their names. David said, "My name is Muhammad." Michael said, "My name is Michael." The Imam turned to the helpers of the mosque and said, "Please bring some food and water for Michael only." Then he turned to the other and said, "Well, Muhammad, Ramazan Mubarak." The focus of my presentation, and I think all of us agree on that we don't have to change our identities to talk to one another. Human rights have come to be perceived as rather exclusively linked to international human rights law in our times. This was mainly an outcome of the transformation of the state in the West to a more liberal, secular, and democratic form starting from the 18th through 20th centuries. Added to that, the entire world had to pay high toll, both in terms of life and economy, in the two, but especially in the latter world wars. So not to suffer from this tragedy another time, it was felt necessary to arouse a global human rights consciousness. It is sad but true, but we sometimes wait for a disaster so that we find the right path. Violence and hatred have not started at 9/11. They are as old as the day human adventure began on the face of the earth. This is why our greatest challenge is not to fight against the enemy on the battlefield. All religious traditions that we have just learned from my other professors is that they have been the scapegoats of terrorism. Islam in the case of 9/11, Christianity in the recent attacks in Norway. But religions actually can provide best guides for their respective communities as much as for those who want to benefit from them. Just as we have not developed terms like secularist or atheist terrorism because of the violence by Marxist Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, who were the pioneers of suicide belts and killed over 8,000 people. Or because of, again, Marxist PKK terrorists in Turkey who claimed the lives of over perhaps 40,000 Kurdish and Turkish people. We should not associate and defame religions and their members with violence and terrorism. I think to bring this cycle of suspicion to an end is very much related with how we remember atrocities of 9/11. Remembrance is significant for a nation to survive and maintain identity. But it is equally significant to moderate this survival so as not to deny the existence of other nations. Will the motto "never forget" continue to dominate our vision for revenge or for other reasons? Let us make a list of things nations of the world should never forget, quote unquote. Japanese never forget atomic bombs. Arabs never forget 1967 war. Jews never forget World War II. Armenians and Turks never forget the atrocities of 1915. The French and German never forget Verdun. But the question is, are we going to be able to solve our problems with this never forget spirit? Or are we going to try to reconcile, as German Chancellor Kohl and French President Mitterrand did on September 20th, 1984, at the cemetery in Verdun? Are we going to hate one another or learn to exist in peace and respect, as did the Ottoman Muslims with the Orthodox Greeks? Are we going to consider the other as if they do not exist, or extend the hand to one another as Fethullah Gülen did?
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry to do that to you. Let's bring up, if we could, Scott Stringer.
Well, I want to just say thank you so much to the Turkish Cultural Center for all the support and collaboration we have enjoyed over the years with my office. This is not just a cultural center for the Turkish people. This is a cultural center that speaks to the very center of what New York City is all about. The job of this city, the government, and all of our people is how can we accommodate people of different background, different religion, different culture? How can we manage all of this diversity to make it a powerful economic force for our city, and also send a message to freedom-loving people all over the world that when we band together, nothing can stand in our way. And part of what I think we've learned after 9/11 is that in our diversity is really our strength. The fact that we can all come together and recognize that even though there are haters out there, people who will seek to divide us based on religion, our culture, people who will always say, how can all of these folks actually get along and live together? They will try to divide us. And what we have to do in this city is really send a message to the world that you can't divide people whose common denominator is doing the right thing by everybody. You know, we have thousands of churches and synagogues, hundreds of mosques in this city, and that speaks to our tolerance. But we also have to figure out what our common agenda is going to be. It doesn't always mean that we have to agree on every issue, New Yorkers who agree on everything. That's not what we're about. We have to take all of our give and take and turn into something very positive.
I just would like to thank Turkish Cultural Center for organizing such a wonderful event and having me as a moderator here today. So it is a fact that we have some challenges. So the question is, how can we cope with these challenges in order to create a common future?
I would like to take the challenge of addressing these common challenges, which I will use instead of challenge enemies of our humanity, in light of two major questions. What are or who are our common challenges and enemies? And these two questions that I would like to pose, and I will give my honest answers briefly, is whether or not these common enemies and challenges are different in different times and different space. The second question is whether or not these challenges and common enemies of humanity is external or internal. It's pretty much the both. I think if you do not understand the continuity and the change in our common challenges and enemies of humanity, and if we only focus on the change, if we only focus and isolate ourselves in the current days and in the different and the most recent form and shape of our common challenges, if we miss the continuity part, I think not only we will miss the mark entirely, but we will misdiagnose the issue, and in our efforts to go to a common future, we will not necessarily go that far. Because often, and it's not always, the enemies, the external enemies, they say terrorism, hate, violence, etc., do not necessarily make any effective impact and destruction in a society if their immunity system, if their health, if their functionality in their society is somewhat intact. The enemy always, the external enemies always enter to the building from the doors that we leave open, from the holes that we create in the walls of our own house. We will have to not only understand that the common challenges and enemies are almost the same. It just manifests itself in different times, in different forms and shapes. But it always goes through and attacks from the weaknesses and the failures of our immune system. One theologian whose name has not been mentioned here, but he's very, very significant, the late 19th and the early 20th century, Turkish religious leader and theologian who inspired, of Kurdish descent, he himself was Kurdish, who inspired many people, including Fethullah Gülen himself. I think in his words, these two major questions are answered, and the major common enemies of humanity has been crystallized the most beautifully. Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, who grew up and witnessed the very tragic and traumatic failure and the collapse of Muslim civilization in the context of Ottoman Empire, and went through all sorts of oppression, discrimination, and imprisonment, etc. But like a Mandela style and Gandhi style, he led an inspirational, active resistance towards all the discrimination that he has faced. And as early as 1890s, when he was asked the very same question, who are or what is or what are the common enemies of Islam and Muslims? This is time when the Muslims are feeling that the European Judeo-Christian aggression and violence is taking place in the form of colonialism. This is time Muslims are beating their chest and complaining and blaming all these tragedies falling upon them. And Bediüzzaman says the common enemies of Islam and Muslims, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, neither Jews nor Christians, nor Europeans or the people of the East. The common enemies of Islam, in his time, it was very, very significant and historical. And he says, the common enemies of Islam is the very same enemies of all humanity. It is the same enemies that crippling our humanity. And therefore, we Muslims not only should fight against these common enemies of humanity, but also ally and partner with Christians and other people of faith and fight these enemies. And in 20s and 30s, this is several decades before the Second Vatican Council, he writes a letter to the Pope in Vatican and says, we Christians and Muslims put our differences aside because the forces of evil has taken an upper hand over the forces of good and forces of divine and godly forces on the face of earth, and we should fight against these together in brotherhood and sisterhood. He says these three major enemies of humanity, and therefore the enemies of Islam and Muslims, is the first ignorance, the second poverty, and the third is disunity, division, the polarization in our society.